It'd be fun.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right.
Let me know, and I can kind of. I just want to kind of introduce you a bit. You can sort of talk about yourself, and then you can kind of get cranking.
Yeah, for sure. Give me let's see. Give the guys maybe like 2 minutes to join, and then I can I can do this. Let me get this out of here. Start over again. Going through all my slides beforehand.
Yeah.
Wait 1 second. So this will be the first time I've done this for a while. Let me just do this.
Ooh.
Okay, there we go.
You got fancy. You did a Prezi for us.
Yeah, man. You guys, yeah. Only the best for you.
You got fancy. You did a Prezi for us. Yeah, man. You guys, yeah.
Was that over YouTube? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, you're just muted. Okay. All right. Well, I guess let's just go ahead and get started. How many, who do we got over there? I'd like to hear what, a little bit about you guys too, who I'm talking to and stuff. That'd be awesome. Get started? Okay, no problem. All right. Let's get started here. Here we go. All right. So, I've been asked by a good friend, kind of a good long friend of mine, Zach Herring, to do a little presentation on React for his company. And so I've been kind of just throwing stuff together for a couple of days here trying to get this ready. And so it's literally a React.js crash course. I'll probably be crashing through it a little bit. So just a little brief history real quick. I'll go ahead and just kind of go on to this. So first we're going to talk about me just a second. We'll talk about React. We'll talk about the virtual DOM and JSX, how components work, jQuery to React, and Angular 1 to React. So I'm Andrew DelPrete. I'm 32. I've been married for 10 years. I've got a couple of boys, 3 of them, maybe more. I work for MusicBed and Film Supply. So just quick history there. I've been there for about a year and a half. And when I first got there, it was pretty much kind of a mangled jQuery setup. There's a lot of stuff in one file, things in other files, and wasn't really a framework to kind of tie it all together. And then during that process, when I started for them, we actually started a new kind of company or brand called Film Supply. So MusicBed is a music licensing company, and Film Supply is like a stock footage or a clip licensing company. And so we built Film Supply completely on Angular 1. It's almost been 2 years since we started on that, probably about, about 2 years. So that was kind of one of the bigger Angular projects I've ever worked on. And it took a while, and it was very educational, I guess. So been doing that, but recently we've kind of had the discussion about, hey, do we want to switch over from Angular 1 to Angular 2? What does that look like? Or do we want to go with something like React? And so we kind of made the decision that we would go and move over to React. This was about 5 to 6 months ago. So this is before Angular 2 really started talking about releasing, and they've been talking about it for a while, and it's still not released, but close. So we needed to make a decision then, and React seemed like the best option, and really liked it and dug into it. So long story short is that we are kind of moving MusicBed over to more of a React type of build, and Film Supply is on Angular 1 still, and we will probably convert that over to React as well at some point. So that's that. I've been in the industry for 16 years. I live in Southeast Alaska, beautiful, beautiful place in Alaska. And I enjoy reading, running, hiking, and chopping wood. And I know Zach. So that's that. So let's get started here. About React. So something that people kind of get confused with, probably not now as much as when React first came out, but a lot of people came from Angular thinking, hey, I'm just going to kind of switch my stuff over from Angular to React, and it should have all the same type of stuff because it's a framework, right? So it's gonna have all the same type of nifty features. And so that was like the first thing that I hit and ran up against is, hey, it's not Angular. It is not Ember. It's something different. The only thing I can really liken React to is like the newest form of jQuery. I don't know. That might be a wrong thing there, but basically React is just the V in MVC. So it's the view layer. It doesn't make any assumptions about the rest of your technology stack. So it's easy to try out on a small feature in an existing project. So that's kind of how React advertises itself. So much like you would use jQuery or something to go in and start adding some functionality to a site that exists already, you can kind of do the same thing with the React, or you can start from scratch. So what is React? So React is the view layer. React offers composable components, which we will look at a little bit later. One of the biggest things for me coming from Angular was the one-way data flow, whereas with Angular, there's like 1,000 ways to do one way, or 1,000 ways to do the same thing with, either you're going to use like a broadcast and like a pub sub type of thing where you're trying to listen for changes on something and go ahead and update your directive or your view from your controller. You have lots of different ways to like listen to things with watches. Some things are automatic, and your data, like the flow of that is very convoluted to me. And you can write a good, clean Angular application without doing all that, but it's not very intuitive to do it like that. Like you don't really know to do that from their documentation or from really anywhere. It's just it's kind of a weird way of doing things, and it makes it very hard to find where you're actually changing data or adding data or updating a view, or a template or whatever. So things can be everywhere. You have your models inside your views. You have things happening with a two-way binding that you just don't know where the source of truth is at, is basically what I'm saying. It uses the virtual DOM and diffing for applying updates, whereas like Angular would use like dirty checking. Angular 2 is doing something different now, and other frameworks have kind of moved away from that, but the virtual DOM is a very fast and efficient way of doing things. You can both do client-side and server-side rendering, so you can render a component in your browser, or you can render it on your server and feed it to your browser, and basically that will help with like your search engine stuff, for it to be indexed. So it's basically rendered before it's even served to the browser, and then the browser just takes it from there. So that's much better than what we're doing for Angular, where we have to take snapshots and things. And since it's an entire JavaScript application, you have to basically take snapshots of what it looks like after it's been rendered with JavaScript, and then serve that to Facebook or to Twitter or to Google. Anyway, so React is more of a library than a framework, and you'll kind of see why in a second. It works good with immutable data. I won't go into immutable data too much with this, but it's kind of what React is good with. It's most effective and most efficient when you are replacing state rather than mutating state. All right, so I want to talk about the one-way data flow just a second. Data flows down. This was taken from somewhere else. I don't think I gave them credit, but I might have to do that. So basically, data flows down through a component. So we'll see that in a second, but it goes from a parent to a child component. So you can pass down data through properties from the parent component to the child component. So basically you like nest a child component inside a parent component and you assign properties to it, and then the child component will render with those properties. You can pass callbacks or event handlers like on click or different things that you need to run from your parent component to your child component. And so you have this kind of like this nice flow of, hey, your parent component owns your child component and has the necessary event handlers and properties to send to your, or necessary event handlers and state to pass down as props to your child component. The child component, you can click on something if it's a button or whatever, and it goes back up and actually uses the functionality from the parent component. So if you're coming from Angular, you can think of a parent component as something that owns it, or almost like your controller. So we will move on from that for now. Okay, so what React isn't. React is not a full stack framework. So you're not going to see things like with Angular, like ng resource, or oh gosh, what else is there? Even ng messages. There's a lot of Angular modules that were built by like the Angular team, or that are just part of like the Angular stack, that are make it more of a full stack framework. Whereas React, you kind of have to piecemeal it together. It gives you that flexibility to use whatever you want, but it's kind of at the cost of knowing how to find those things in different packages. There's no two-way binding. It uses that one-way data flow we just talked about. It's not a templating language. Some people think that React is like kind of like Mustache or whatever, and it's more powerful than just a plain templating language. It doesn't have a model, like whereas Angular is sort of like your model is kind of connected to your view, or you can put things in services and kind of feed that through. There's no router. There's a lot of other no things that doesn't just have, but you have things that you can download by third-party people, like React Router is the main one. You can make single-page applications with that. Okay, next. Okay, so we're going to talk about the virtual DOM and JSX. React abstracts away the DOM, giving a simpler programming model and better performance. React can also render on the server side using Node. It also can use PHP or other like Ruby and things like that. There's packages out there for that, and it can, and which use Node. So there's things like that. And it can power native apps like React Native. So we're going to talk about the virtual DOM a little bit. The virtual DOM is a lightweight abstract version of the DOM stored in memory. Can be written with DOM helpers or JSX. Much faster than working with the real DOM. Efficient diffing, comparing, and re-rendering. Faster than dirty checking. So basically, you write your DOM in your JavaScript in your React component, and it stores that in a manner where it can make updates and changes effectively and quickly. Whereas, at least with Angular 1, and the dirty checking is, it has to kind of interpolate the entire page starting at ng app, and then it kind of goes through, and every change that you made or every input field that you type on change, it has to go through and check all the different watches that it's watched, every directive, and see if something has changed, and then updates. This has a less overhead than keeping the whole DOM in memory. It's just the parts it needs. So what is JSX? It's syntactic sugar for writing virtual DOM. It looks very similar to HTML. It's much more powerful than a templating language and must be transpiled by something like Babel. And so Babel is something, I don't know if you guys have worked with it before, but it's just something to transpile kind of the newest version of ES6 JavaScript into ES5, so our browsers can use it. So it just allows you to write newer forms of the newer syntax of JavaScript and use it today, because it'll just compile down to or transpile down to ES5. And so Babel has a plugin to use JSX and transpile that to ES5 JavaScript, and we'll look at that in a second. Okay, so time for an example. So let's see if this is going to work here. Let me do that here. Okay, so this is a CodePen called Virtual DOM and JSX. Basically, my first example, and hopefully you guys can see this. Zach, can you guys see this? Okay, I can try to make it a little bigger, maybe. Let's see here.
Yeah, just a little bigger. That's
a little bigger. Okay, I'll try to do that. I'll have to scroll a lot. So in this CodePen here, basically I have created one component, and this is kind of the traditional way without JSX to create DOM. And if you're coming from just like being like an HTML, CSS guy or any type of templating language, you're probably gonna be like, what? Like, I don't want to have to like create elements by using a create element function. So basically, this H1 and H2, they are being created using this virtual DOM library and are inside of a section. So it's basically H1 and H2 inside a section. So that's kind of how the virtual DOM works. This particular component, as you can see, is just like a plain JavaScript function. But I have a property here that I'm using ES6 to destructure that I'm passing a title and a subtitle. And so if I scroll down here, the way that React works is you take like a DOM node and you have like a ID or a class or whatever you want to do, as long as you have like a div or some sort of DOM node to mount to. My first one here is React VDOM example. So that's my HTML. And then what I'm doing here is I have this React DOM library that renders that component that I made up here to that DOM node. So I'm passing in this VDOM example component with a title of my VDOM component and subtitle using React create element. So as you can see down here, this is my H1 and H2. These are being rendered with this component. So it's a very basic way of doing this. So this is called a pure component or a pure function component. It's just a JavaScript function that renders a component. So that's example one. So I'm going to try to actually do that. And then go down to example two. Let's see if this one works still. All right. So here's a second example. This is a little cleaner. So we're going to kind of take this from one step where it's not very clean and kind of hard to read to being even more readable. So this one, React provides a convenience wrapper. Sorry. A convenience wrapper of different HTML tags and allows you to use those instead. So instead of saying create element, I can say section. And then inside of that, I have H1, H2, and things like that. So this will have an attribute or a property of class. That's just how you set a class name in JavaScript. So that's why it's class name rather than just class, but it'll have the class of hero or the class of title or subtitle. So that's one way of doing it. And then if we keep going on, this here. This is the JSX example. So with JSX, you get the liberty of typing or of kind of having this cleaner style of code that's more familiar to how you would write typical HTML. It's not exactly, but it's close enough for people that are trying to move over to it to have a pretty good feel for what it needs to do. There are converters out there, like you can actually go online and see and actually convert like an HTML to JSX, and it'll just kind of add class name where there would be class, things like that. But basically, as you can see, the same thing as before. I have a function called JSX header, and I have my section, my H1 and H2. So I'm rendering that. Once you mount it into the DOM node, React kind of handles it from there. So you're just kind of responsible for giving it somewhere to place its DOM. So it's all going inside of here. That's a good point to make if you're trying to move something over from jQuery or even Angular. If you can just if you have a jQuery directive or something or a component, you can kind of replace that incrementally by giving it like a DOM node and then just start adding functionality into the component. Okay, so that's it for that example. And I'll just kind of do that. And I will go back to here. And let's see if I can do this where I left off at. Okay. And let's go back here. Sorry about that. Okay, how components work. So now that we're talking about components, they can either be a class or a pure function. When I say class, they can be like an ES6 JavaScript class. And React also has another way, like a factory function type of way of creating a class. It can have child components, like we saw earlier with the H1, H2s. They're composable, meaning that you can reuse child components to build other components. So if you have like, let's say you have a sidebar or something component, inside of that you had like 4 or 5 components, and then also you have like a header component. Inside of that you have a couple of those same components for some reason, maybe like an avatar image or something in their sidebar and in your header. You can reuse those components just by kind of just adding them into the parent component. They're re-rendered when props or state changes. Can have functions, values passed as props. Can use prop types in order to specify what type each prop should be. If you ever worked with something like a statically typed or a strongly typed language, I can't remember the difference, but we don't have that in JavaScript, but we do get a little bit of that with React and TypeScript if you ever use that. Anyway, and I think they're like an Angular 1 directive, but like 10 times easier. And last night I was killing myself making this thing because Angular was driving me crazy because it's been a while since I worked with it. But anyway, so Angular 1 actually came out with components now to kind of help bring on Angular 2, and those are a lot easier to use. But anyway, I think React is still easier. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. And this is going to be a little bigger example here. Let me get this closed. So I have one mounting point here called app. So again, you provide that to React and it mounts your component in here, and then React handles it from there. So let me actually close that and bring this down a little bit. So a class component. So we're going to talk about class components and pure components for a second. So a class component is, like I said, an ES6 class. My component name is app and extends this React component. Within your React, within your class component, you can do different things like lifecycle hooks. So like on on component mounts, you can do something when the component updates. Excuse me. When the component updates, you can have it do something, just kind of hooks that you can tie into the component. Other methods in here, and there's other things you can do in here as well. But this is just like a plain rendering of a component like I was doing earlier. So as you can see, it's just rendering an H1 tag using JSX, and I'm rendering the title property. So, and down here, I've got my mounting point, which I'm mounting to app, and I'm passing title, this 1A hello world, which you're seeing here. So that's example 1. All right, example 2. Hopefully these all work still. All right, so 1B. So this is a pure function. I wrote it just a little differently from the last example that I showed you guys, but this is basically a function. It's actually an ES6 function, an arrow function, and it cannot have. It's also called a stateless function. It can't have all those lifecycle hooks or state inside of it. It's just all it is just for rendering DOM. So like this. A lot of times you use these functions to be like child components for something else that like a parent component that passes in props like I'm doing here, and we'll see that in a second. So that's a pure function component. So class components and pure function components. So components are composable. So let's look at this. All right. So components are composable. App has 2 properties, title and subtitle. App has 2 child components, title and subtitle. An app is a composed component because it utilizes title and subtitle. So app is considered a composed component because I'm building the component with other components. And so that's kind of one of the nice things about React, or just the component architecture period, is you can take these smaller components and embed them or place them in your parent components. And this parent component basically owns these components now. And so I can pass properties in to it. So I'm just passing title and subtitle from down here. So my app component has got a title property and a subtitle property, and I'm passing those in to basically my constructor, and I'm just passing those into this. Each of the child components has a text property, and I'm passing the title and subtitle into that. And so now my basic pure or stateless child components here are real simple. All they have is one property, which is text. So title gets turned into text, shows as an H1, and subtitle gets turned into text and is rendered as an H2. So just like down here. All right, so that's that example. All right, so this is the big one here. See if I can get this all like that, and I need this one down here. All right. So smart and dumb components. So a smart component is kind of like what I was saying earlier, is it's a component which wraps or owns. So you can think of it as like a parent component, one or more child components, and is in charge of re-rendering them via state change, like a controller. App is our smart component. So app right here, I've got a class component, and you'll see I have a constructor in here, and I'm setting the initial state of this. So a lot of times in applications, or like almost every time in applications, you need to have some sort of state. And this state has a number property of 0, which is right here. Let's see here. Well, let me go here. Okay, dumb components, which is a component which is oblivious of whom it's receiving its props from. It just cares about receiving properties and rendering. Increment number and increment button are dumb components. So if I go down here, increment number and increment button are inside of app. So they're kind of dumb components. They can be added anywhere, and all they care about really is getting a number property, and the increment button, all it cares about is getting a on button click property. So you can pass in, again, values or functions. So in this case, I need my button to do something, right? So I'm passing in a handle click method. So right here, I have handle click. I'm adding this into my app, my parent app kind of smart component. And what app is doing, or what handle click is doing, is it's setting the state for this. So basically, it's taking my number property that I set in the beginning, and then I'm just taking that and I'm adding 1 to it. So it means it could be that too. But anyhow, so it's this state number plus 1. So whenever I click that button, it should add 1 to it, right? So the state is handled in app, which could be anything. It doesn't have to be app, but that's my parent smart component, and then my dumb components are just in charge of implementing it. So that's that. That's kind of how, I mean, you can almost do anything. If you get that, you can almost do anything with it. That's kind of the architecture of React. Oops, don't do that. Let me do this. Oh, actually, I want to show you one more thing here, which is part of this. Those prop types. So if I do this here, same example, but I was talking to you earlier about prop type. So since we don't have static types or type definitions in JavaScript, React gives you a way to actually kind of specify or declare your prop types and what type each prop is. So if it's a number or a string or an object, if that's what it's expecting, then you can assign that here. And if you give it any other value or any other type, it'll throw a console, like a runtime error, which is very helpful for new developers coming in, or even yourself and your future self, to see like, oh, hey, this property here, increment, number, pretty self-explanatory here in this case, but it is expecting a number. And on button click is expecting a function. But sometimes it's not so self-explanatory. So like if I were to come in here and pass in, instead of a number, if I was to pass in like a maybe like an object, something like that, it would throw an error. Now, for some reason, it doesn't work in CodePen, but that's pretty self-explanatory there, I think. So I think that's it for that example. Kind of blowing through this pretty quick. I'll just leave that there. Next. Okay. Right. jQuery to React. So recently, when switching some of MusicBed over to React, we had like this very daunting task of refactoring some really big components or features on MusicBed to React, and just code was just everywhere, and it was very hard to sort through where things were going. And I found that relying heavily on classes or IDs to select and manipulate your HTML can be very brittle. In other words, if you have a jQuery or a JavaScript file with jQuery in it, you're using classes or IDs to like make changes, things can break easily, especially if those classes change. So now you have classes inside your HTML and you have classes inside your CSS and in your JavaScript. And if any one of those change at any point in time, something's going to break. And then you have to deal with the overhead of that. So if you want to click on something and hide something, you have to manually go in there and add an event handler. You click on it, and then you set that element to hide. It can be done, but it's not really made for that, I don't think. So that's why I'm kind of calling React the jQuery, well, not necessarily 2.0, but you can do a lot with what you would normally do in jQuery, but with React, and have a lot more convention to it. You can incrementally update your app from jQuery to React. One kind of tip for doing that is look for a wrapper or container element controlled by jQuery and start replacing with React. We'll look at that in a second. React can be integrated just about anywhere, and give it a DOM node, mount a component, React will take it from there. So this is actually an example that I did for an article I wrote a couple weeks ago. So basically, this is a jQuery thing. When I click on this button, I got different emojis with different text. So on the left here, I have my HTML, I have a mood container, and then I have some DOM in here. And then on my JavaScript side of it, I have an array of objects with the different options for the different moods. So it's a random moods. Oops, gosh. So with jQuery, you'll typically see something like this. You'll cache the wrapper for further use. So you'll kind of create like a variable that selects that wrapper. And then you'll start creating like variables that select the different things inside the wrapper, like mood emoji or mood name or mood button. So I have those over here. Again, very coupled to the naming of my classes. Then I have to add like event handlers here. So when I click the button, go ahead and get a random mood, and then go ahead and replace the emoji container text with that random mood and the name with the random mood. So that's kind of how that works. It works. I mean, it's something small like this. Hey, why not? But like, again, if I change this, it's done. I don't have an emoji anymore, and then to build on this is just crazy to try to think about all the things you need to do here. All right, so that's that. Let me close this and come back here and try to click on that guy. So here's that same example, but in React. So now all I have now is I have one container. Remember, you just need to give it a container like a DOM node and then mount your component to it, and then let React take it from there. So you write everything in React now. So I have the same type of thing here. I've got my moods. Oh, first of all, I have a mood randomizer component. And it's a smart component because it has state. I've got moods set up here as a property. I've got state here. So I have like a default state of emoji placeholder and null for the image. And and then I have a on-click handler for, let's see if I can make this better. Actually, here, let me close this and that. There we go. So this is my button handler here. So when this is clicked, I am going to fetch a random mood, and then I'm going to set the state. So here I go. So now this is my component. This is what is rendered to the screen. I still have the same classes and everything, so I can do my BEM, my styling, CSS. But instead of using selectors and things like find the node and then place the emoji in the text of that node, I'm just assigning it the state, the mood state, and the mood name from the state. And when I click on it, I'm just running that event handler and then setting the state again. So it just grabs it and then re-renders everything. If I had child components in here, like say I made the button another component instead of just a button here, I could actually add that button into another component and pass it properties. So I could pass it a name property and then give it the state mood name. And then whenever that state mood name changes, everything inside of that component re-renders, and that component would get re-rendered. So like if I had a random mood button and I passed that state as a property, that button would re-render as well. Didn't do that for this example, but anyway, you can kind of see that. Okay, next. Almost done actually. So we got so this is a fun one here. Angular 1 to React. It was really hard to put this in words because I don't know. I think you just have to try it. It wasn't as difficult as I thought, but we have done some replacing of Angular and also React inside of Angular directives. And yesterday, my coworker Michael actually put or was it the other way around? Basically, we had some like React Angular inception and vice versa. We had Angular and React and Angular, and it was messy, but it's just what we needed to do while we kind of move over from Angular. So you can incrementally update your app from Angular to React by replacing things like directives and components one at a time. And just one thing about that, depending on how your Angular app is created and written, if you use a lot of directives and components, it's almost a similar architecture to what we're talking about in React. That type of architecture is really easily replaceable by React because it's already set up that way. But if you have controllers and views everywhere, it's kind of difficult. You have to kind of take it another step. React components can be embedded inside an Angular template if needed. Typo. React simply mounts to an element and takes care of rendering and managing the DOM from there, which I've said over again, but it's one of the main things there. You can mount multiple components and write functions to manually remount them for things like route changes, async, or other scenarios where you may need to re-render the React component. On our MusicBed app, website, don't do that. On the MusicBed site, the player at the very bottom of your screen when you play a song is connected to React. And we're using PJAX on MusicBed to kind of have like this seamless transition between pages. So it's not a single page application, but we do have PJAX running, so it looks like it is. And so we found that when we switched pages, we would need to re-render some React component. And so PJAX has like a hook for when a page is updated using PJAX and when it's done. And what we did is we just inside that method or that hook, we just had a function that said re-render React player. And all it is just a function that does exactly what I showed you earlier, which is that React DOM render and just remounts the node. It's literally just running a function, and then React is good to go again. And that's one of the main things I really love about React is it really just hones in on your JavaScript skills and it allows you to do things like that. It's just function calling and JavaScript. Okay, so here's the last example here, the one I was pulling my hair out last night because it's been so long since I've worked in Angular. And again, this is a pretty easy example, so I felt stupid almost for having such a hard time with it, but I've forgotten. So I have two increment buttons here, one from earlier and one that's Angular. So this top one is Angular, and this one is React. In my DOM, I have an Angular ng app, which is sort of how you would instantiate or initialize an Angular application. And then I have an increment number component, or excuse me, a directive, and an increment button directive. In Angular, there's like a million ways I could have done this, but I went ahead and just did it the directive way. Again, if you don't have your application set up with directives and components like this, moving over to React is difficult, but you can do it. They're self-contained. They're very similar to a component, but they're hard. So one of my main frustrations with directives last night when I was doing this is that the documentation was just crazy. Like the thing I was thinking about the whole time when I was trying to figure it out again was that if I was to look up in the dictionary what overly constructed or overly, I don't even know the word, the Angular directive would be there as the definition, because it's just like crazy what over architecture is what I'm thinking. It's just crazy what they're doing and anyway, I'm glad we're not having to do that much anymore. Anyhow, so I have an Angular example module here, which ties into my ng app. And then I have a service, which I'm using as sort of like my model or like my state. And then I have my two directives. I have increment number and I have increment button. So increment number, basically all it does is it shows a number in an H1 tag. And then when the service receives, well, let me go to the other button first. Under increment button, I'm showing a button. Let me close this again. I'm showing a button, and when it's clicked on, I'm running this increment method, which calls my increment service method. And so that updates my kind of my store or my state. And then when that updates, I broadcast a change called increment, which increment number receives right here on kind of like a pub sub system. And then it goes ahead and updates my number with the new number from my service, which is up here. So it's kind of done this roundabout way. It's actually a lot cleaner than a lot of people do it. Angular also offers you a way to require controllers from each directive, and that was where I was having a hold up last night. It was not intuitive. It's been a long time since I've done it, and it gets crazy. It was just a really crazy thing. So on Film Supply, we did a lot of this type of stuff where we create services that actually hold models or holds state of things, and then what we do is we use the Angular dependency injection, and we inject the service into our directives or into our controllers, and that way we have, we can update our app with, the different things that are in our service. So like my number here is being updated by the increment service here. So it's all kind of tied in together. Again, I know that's not the best this way, but I found that that's probably one of the only ways that I found that I could manage about something like this. With React, there's several ways to do this, and I've already showed you one way. I'm not going to get into another way, but there is the main way is basically when you have a parent component, like for instance, in here I have React example. Before I called it app. When you have a parent component that wraps or owns other components, that owner, that parent has like the say. It's a smart component. It's like your controller, and you could just pass in properties or event handlers to those child components. So this is basically the same example I was showing you earlier. And just a side note, that's one way to do it. So like a lot of times, like when you're building an application from scratch, you're able to do that. You're able to wrap your entire application in one parent, right? And start having things controlled on a page from like almost like your page controller. this could be like about page. I don't want to call it controller, but it could be like your about page controller, and then inside of that you have your methods, and you pass them into like your sidebar or your content or something, and you pass those in, and basically it owns those components now, and basically it gives that data and those event handlers and updates it from there. That's one way to do it. Sometimes we don't have that privilege. Sometimes we can't wrap our entire application with React and do that, especially on an existing application. So I'm not going to go into it now, but there's something that you can use called Redux or Flux. You might have heard of that before from the Facebook community, but it just allows you to have components all over the place. Like if they don't have to be wrapped by one single component, you could have like a sidebar in one spot, like a header in another spot, and you can connect them to a single state or a single store. And that way they can feed off the same data together, but be in separate places on your site. So I think that's it. Let me look here. So boom, and the end. So gotta fix that. So there's a couple of cool articles. There's React 101 condensed by a friend of mine named Eric Abar, and he goes through a really good explanation of React, and some of it I actually took for this presentation a little bit. And then I had an article that I put out, or that Scotch.io put out a couple weeks ago, called How to Sprinkle React.js into an Existing Application. So if you're thinking about moving from another framework or jQuery or something to React, it kind of goes at Facebook, the React docs about thinking in React. And it just talks about that single flow and composable components and all that. And with that, I think I'm done. Right at 45 minutes.
I'm gonna risk the sound loop and
sure.
First off, thanks a ton for putting this together, dude. This is a lot of work.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, that was awesome. So yeah, there's a ton of people in here. So I think we wanted to reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. I think
sure.
Deru, you had a quick question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what size of the team are you working with? Music
Bed.
Music Bed?
Yeah.
I think we have 13 or 14 developers. We just hired 2 more this week. So yeah, we have we're distributed somewhat. I live in Alaska. The main office is in Fort Worth. A bunch of the guys work there, and then we have a company in London that actually contracts with us full time. And we have a guy in Seattle and a lady in Utah. So it's, like I said, like about 14.
Very cool. Any other questions?
So are you still looking at Angular 2, or are you giving up on Angular?
Man, that's a hard question. I'm not giving up on it. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and I've looked into it a little bit. I'm sort of one of those that I've got, like I said, 3 kids and a very busy life. And I'm just kind of getting to the place now where I can't really afford to just like go digging into every single thing. So I'm kind of taking React and saying, hey, I'm going to just push what I know with it. I really like it. And I think that Angular 2 is going to be a great option at some point. I don't know if we'll ever switch to it, but I will definitely look into it when it's fully released. I'm not really into this, like the beta or the pre-release or the release candidate stage yet, where I'm just in there figuring stuff out. I'll let everybody else do that, write some good tutorials, and then I'll get in there while I'm messing with React and building things. So, but I think it's a good framework. I don't necessarily like, this is totally an opinion, and I know that I got people listening in, you, David, I'm talking to you, that are really against having kind of like your DOM being controlled. I know that. What? Say that again.
Oh, you dropped in it. You dropped out of there that last sentence. I think Alaska is doing something.
Yeah, Alaska might be. Well, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'll just suffice it to say is that I don't really like Angular 2's syntax in their templates. Like they have all these crazy, I don't even know what you would call them, just conventions or like kind of like the ng model, but now they're using like different symbols, and I don't know, it gets kind of crazy with the templating. Like you have to learn a whole new language for the view itself, whereas like with JSX or with React, you're basically using JavaScript, and you're rendering things. The only thing you really need to learn differently is JSX, which is pretty easy. Anything else?
Go for it. Huh?
So we're all, doing our crazy protractors. So what kind of testing are you guys doing with the React.js stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So this is what I love almost the most here, and I didn't talk about that at all. But man, this stuff is super easy to test. So I've tested things in Angular in the past, and it's like it was a nightmare, especially getting started. With React, it's cool because what you can do is, since React takes a component that you've built and then it mounts it to a DOM node, that can almost be considered as like not a string, but just something that is traversable. And so what you can do is, like, all React components render something. It has the output of something. So a pure React component is super easy to test because it's basically a function that renders DOM. But what you can do with your test is you can use something. Airbnb put out a great package called Enzyme, and there's other ways to do this as well. But it almost gives you like this jQuery like selector syntax, where you can say like, basically what you say is render this component, make sure it's rendered, and what you do is you just say like find inside of that component like a class or a value or something, and then make sure it exists. So you assert that that's true. You can also simulate clicks or simulate method and calls, and so you basically render the component like as it is, and then what you can do after the fact is you can kind of search through it and just make sure that it renders. And so it's almost like the best of both worlds. It's almost like your unit test and your like your integration test. So it's like it's not going to open up a browser and like go through and click on things, but you can get like the full browser experience with some finagling or whatever, and actually do some of that stuff. But I find for the most part, you can just render the component, and then you just use like the enzyme, or you can use something called Cheerio, which is very jQuery-ish for selecting things and just making sure they exist, finding things. And so that's kind of what we do. We simulate clicks. We make sure things are rendered. We make sure state is changed. So like that increment button, for instance, if you were to click on the increment button, one thing that you would test would be, hey, when I click this button, you simulate the click. Make sure the state has changed, or make sure that it's 1 plus whatever. And you can just kind of go through that really easily. I don't know if that answers your question, but you can look at React Enzyme, and they give us some really good examples on how to do it with React.
Very cool. I think we got time for one more question. Anyone else have anything? No? Go for it, J-Rip.
I'm interested in the other libraries you need to pull in to kind of make a framework.
Yeah. So a couple ones that we use is Axios for like your promise library for making like, well, promises like HTTP requests. Whereas like Angular, you would have something like REST Angular or the ng resource. Or, so we just use a JavaScript library, so it's not coupled to Angular. So that's got its pros and cons, but I think mostly pros. You're using something that you can use anywhere else. It's not tied to Angular. You can create a file for your services that reach out to an API and just stick them in there and use Axios or something, or even a fetch now. And you can use that in any framework now. You don't have to use ng resource or not ng resource, excuse me, the HTTP service. What else? A React router is another one for routing. So instead of, I think, ng resource, gosh, I can't even remember now. Whatever the routing is, I know that I'll use a UI router at Film Supply. but whatever the one that kind of comes with Angular. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called.
I think it's NG router.
NG router. Okay. Yeah. So you use, React router has one. You can, but you don't have to even use that. I mean, there's a lot of like HTML5 push state routers that are out there that are JavaScript that you could use with it. So you again, you're kind of piecemealing some of that. Validation. Haven't done a lot of validation stuff. I love Angular's ng messages. I use that extensively on Film Supply, but you can use like Validate.js. You can use other libraries that aren't tied to Angular or to React. What other things? Gosh, I'm kind of drawing a blank. There's quite a few. We use things like select eyes, but there's React components for them. You can install. We use npm and Browserify for our build, so we install stuff via npm, and so we just have a lot of things in there to build it.
Cool.
That's all I can think of right now. There's probably more, but that's
what you got.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think that does it, unless anyone has a burning question. Again, I want to just thank you for the time you spent. Do you want to plug like where we can find you online, GitHub, Twitter, talk about Dads and Dev, your podcast?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think like maybe 3.5, 4 months ago, a friend of mine and former coworker, David Hemphill, he and I started a podcast called Dads in Development. It's just dadsindev.com. And we're on iTunes and things like that. If you want to look, I think you actually have to look for Dads in Development, the full thing there. And so we just talk about being dads that are developing and in development. So it's kind of got a double meaning there, but we talk about work-life balance, health, what we're working on the side, all kinds of things. So I think we have 9 episodes out right now. Need to record the 10th. My GitHub and Twitter handle is just Andrew DelPrete. And I can send Zach over the slides or the code pens if you guys are interested in looking at them at all, and you can see that. So yeah, that's about it. And my website's andrewdelprete.com. It's really basic. It just has my contact information and what I'm working on and about me a little bit.
Yep. I'm gonna I'll get the links from you, and then I will include that in the YouTube.
Okay.
And then so we'll have that in the show notes. So
awesome.
Thank you so much, dude. This was fantastic.
Awesome, guys. It was a privilege talking with you, and hope you got something out of it. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely, man. You have a good day.
Okay. Talk to you later, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.